Welcome, dear listeners, to Killer in Briarwood Barn, a Miss Marple mystery. Join the inimitable Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a puzzling crime in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead. Settle in with a cup of tea for this cozy tale of intrigue, observation, and village secrets. Our story begins now. Chapter 1. The Village Fate and a Shocking Discovery. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, was a place where time seemed to linger like morning mist over the meadows. In the summer of 1952, its thatched cottages glowed golden under the July sun, their rose gardens spilling over with blooms that scented the air with sweetness. The lanes, bordered by hedgerows thick with honeysuckle, wound lazily past the church, the post office, and the green where children played and gossips gathered. At the heart of this tranquil scene lived Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster whose modest home, Mead, sat just off the high street. With her snowy hair tucked neatly under a straw hat and her knitting needles ever at hand, Miss Marple was a fixture of the village, as unassuming as the sparrows that flitted through her garden. Yet her eyes, bright and inquisitive behind her spectacles, missed nothing. She had a way of noticing the small things. A glance, a hesitation, a misplaced word that revealed the hidden currents of human nature. As she often remarked to her nephew Raymond, people were much the same everywhere, whether in London or St. Mary Mead, and it was in the ordinary that the extraordinary often hid. On this particular Saturday, the village was alive with the annual fete, held at Briarwood Barn, a sturdy stone structure on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. The barn, weathered by centuries, yet proud with its oak beams and ivy-clad walls, stood adjacent to Briarwood Manor, the grand estate of Sir Reginald Harrington. The fete was the highlight of the village calendar, a day when St. Mary Mead shook off its quiet demeanor and donned a festive air. Stalls lined the barn's Reginald will find fault with something. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking as she worked on a half-finished scarf. Sir Reginald Harrington, the squire of Briarwood Manor, was a man who cast a long shadow over St. Mary Mead. In his 60s, with a bushy mustache and a voice that boomed like a foghorn, he carried himself with the air of a man accustomed to command. His wealth, inherited from a line of landed gentry, was matched only by his pomposity. He was known to stride through the village, critiquing everything from the church flowers to the state of the roads, and his sharp tongue had made him no shortage of enemies. As the fete progressed, Sir Reginald made his rounds, his tweed jacket straining slightly at the waist. He paused at the flower stall, dismissing Mrs. Eleanor Croft's prize roses as passable at best, then sampled a slice of Mrs. Price Ridley's fruitcake with a grimace. "Too much currant," he declared, loud enough for half the barn to hear. Miss Marple, sipping tea at the vicarage stall, watched him closely. She noted the way his hand lingered on a glass of lemonade, offered by young Lily, the maid recently dismissed from Briarwood Manor. Lily, with her auburn curls and defiant expression, poured the drink with a tight smile, her eyes darting away as Sir Reginald took a hearty gulp. Nearby, Nigel Harrington, the squire's nephew, lounged against a hay bale, his London suit out of place among the rustic crowd. His charming smile faltered when his uncle barked at him to stop idling. Miss Vera Langston, a distant cousin of the squire, glided through the fete in a silk dress, her cool demeanor drawing curious glances, and Mr. Josiah Blackwood, the grizzled farmer, stood at his vegetable stall, muttering darkly about Sir Reginald's plans to sell off grazing land. The afternoon wore on, the sun climbing high and casting dappled shadows through the barn's open doors. Miss Marple, now seated in a wicker chair with a second cup of tea, was deep in conversation with Dr. Haydock, the village physician, when a sudden cry pierced the festive hum. "Help! Poison!" The word sent a shiver through the fete, transforming the cheerful gathering into a tableau of shock and suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. The overturned glass, the smudged label on a nearby lemonade bottle, the way Nigel hovered at the edge of the crowd, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. She noted Lily's flushed cheeks as she backed away, and the way Vera Langston's gloved hand tightened on her parasol. Even Blackwood, usually so gruff, looked shaken, his calloused hands gripping the edge of his stall. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, adjusting her spectacles. "How very unfortunate." She stepped closer, her gaze flitting from the glass to the hay bales, where a single stray button glinted in the sunlight. An odd detail, out of place in the rustic setting. The constable, a young man named Polk who was more accustomed to chasing stray sheep than solving crimes, arrived puffing and red-faced. "Miss Marple," he said, mopping his brow, "this is beyond me. Poison, they're saying. Arsenic, perhaps, slipped into his drink." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Poison was a quiet killer, requiring both opportunity and intent. Someone at the fete had both, and in St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business, secrets were never buried deep. "We must be thorough, Mr. Polk," she said softly. "The truth is often in the little things. A glance, a gesture, a glass of lemonade." As the crowd dispersed, whispering of murder and motives, Miss Marple lingered, her sharp eyes scanning the barn. The central mystery had begun, and in the cozy confines of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew that the answer lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet details of village life. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Villagers. The morning after the calamity at Briarwood Barn, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves mourned Sir Reginald Harrington's untimely demise. The village, usually a tapestry of cheerful routine, donned her straw hat and set out for the post office, a hub of village gossip, as reliable as the church clock. The high street was quieter than usual, with only a few villagers hurrying about their errands, their voices hushed. The post office, a squat building with a red-tiled roof, smelled of ink and wax polish. Mrs. Price Ridley, the postmistress, stood behind the counter, her eyes gleaming with the fervor of a woman who thrived on news. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, leaning forward so eagerly that her spectacles slid down her nose. "It's murder, mark my words. Sir Reginald, poisoned right under our noses. Who'd have thought it in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple smiled thinly, adjusting her gloves. "Indeed, Mrs. Price Ridley, a most distressing affair. Have you heard any speculations?" She knew the postmistress needed little prompting, and soon enough, a flood of theories spilled forth. The first name on everyone's lips was Nigel Harrington, Sir Reginald's nephew and heir to Briarwood Manor. A handsome man in his early 30s, Nigel had arrived from London just days before the fete, his sleek motor car and tailored suits drawing admiring glances from the younger villagers. But his charm concealed a strained relationship with his uncle. "They quarreled the night before," Mrs. Price Ridley confided, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Something about the will. Sir Reginald was set to cut Nigel out, or so I heard from Mrs. Croft's maid. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, recalling Nigel's nervous demeanor at the fete. She had seen him lingering near the lemonade stall, his fingers fidgeting with a cigarette case as Sir Reginald berated him. A young man with expectations, she mused aloud, can sometimes act rashly when those expectations are threatened. Mrs. Price Ridley agreed, adding that Nigel had been seen slipping out of the barn during the fete for a private telephone call, a detail that piqued Miss Marple's interest. Telephone calls, in her experience, were often less private than over land rights. He was set to sell off my grazing meadows, Mrs. Price Ridley reported, relaying Blackwood's own words from the pub. Said it'd ruin him. He was at the fete, glowering like a storm cloud. Miss Marple remembered Blackwood's weathered hands gripping his vegetable stall, his eyes fixed on Sir Reginald as the squire sampled his lemonade. Land disputes, she knew, could stir deep resentments, especially in a man as tied to the soil as Blackwood. The postmistress hesitated before mentioning Lily, the young maid recently dismissed from Briarwood Manor. A fiery one, that girl, she said, pursing her lips. Caught arguing with Sir Reginald the day before the fete. He accused her of stealing silver spoons, of all things. Lily, with her auburn curls and defiant air, had been pouring lemonade at the fete, her hand steady despite the squire's sharp words. Miss Marple's mind lingered on the glass in Sir Reginald's hand, its contents spilled into the straw. A dismissed servant, she said, often carries a grudge, though not always a murderous one. Finally, there was Miss Vera Langston, Sir Reginald's distant cousin, who had arrived unannounced for the fete. Elegant and aloof, with a silk scarf and a cool smile, Vera had drawn curious stares. She's after a share of the estate, Mrs. Price Ridley whispered. Some old family claim, but Sir Reginald wouldn't hear of it. Miss Marple recalled Vera's gloved hands and the way she'd lingered near the barn's entrance, watching the crowd with an unreadable expression. Family ties, Miss Marple murmured, can be as binding as they are bitter. As she left the post office, Miss Marple paused by the village green, where a breeze stirred the elms. Her eyes fell on a discarded lemonade bottle half buried in the grass, its label smudged as if handled carelessly. She bent down, careful not to disturb it, and noted the faint trace of powder on its rim. Not sugar, but something finer, almost invisible. Interesting, she said to herself, straightening up. The bottle was one of many from the fete, supplied the detail. Gloves, she thought, could hide many things. Stains, perhaps, or traces of poison. As she walked back to Dane Mead, Miss Marple passed the blacksmith's forge, where Mr. Blackwood was unloading a cart of turnips. He caught her eye and nodded gruffly, but his hands trembled slightly. From exertion, or something else. She filed the observation away, alongside Nigel's nervous fidgeting, Mrs. Croft's tight smile, Lily's defiance, and Vera's cool detachment. The village was a puzzle, and each villager a piece, their motives and movements interlocking in ways yet to be revealed. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. The clouds had parted, casting a soft light through her window, and she sipped her tea, reflecting on the morning's gleanings. Poison, she knew, was a weapon of precision, requiring both opportunity and intent. Someone at the fete had seized that opportunity, slipping arsenic, or so the whispers suggested, into Sir Reginald's glass. But who? Nigel, with his inheritance at stake. Mrs. Croft, pressed by debt. Blackwood, defending his land. Lily, stung by dismissal. Or Vera, nursing a hidden grievance. The smudged bottle and Tommy's mention of Vera's gloves were threads in the tapestry, but the pattern was not yet clear. "People are so careless," Miss Marple said aloud, her needles clicking rhythmically. "They leave traces of themselves, even when they think they've covered their tracks." She smiled faintly, knowing that in St. Mary Mead, where every glance and gesture carried meaning, the truth would not stay hidden for long. Chapter 3. Tea and Initial Inquiries. The afternoon sun filtered through the vicarage windows, casting a golden glow over the parlor where Miss Jane Marple sat, her hands folded neatly over her knitting. It was Monday, 2 days after the shocking death of Sir Reginald Harrington at the Briarwood Barn fete, and St. Mary Mead remained abuzz with unease. The vicarage, a rambling house with creaking floors and rose-patterned wallpaper, was the heart of the Harrington, Sir Reginald's nephew, his London polish slightly tarnished by the strain of recent events. His tie was loosened, and his hands trembled as he reached for a scone, a detail Miss Marple noted with interest. Lily, the dismissed maid, stood by the door, serving tea with a sullen air, her auburn curls escaping their cap. Mr. Josiah Blackwood, the farmer, slouched in an armchair, his muddy boots leaving faint marks on the rug. Miss Vera Langston, the squire's distant cousin, sat apart, her silk dress immaculate and her expression unreadable. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, completed the gathering, his kindly face creased with concern as he stirred his tea. The conversation began with polite platitudes about the weather, but it soon turned to the fete. "A dreadful business," the vicar said, shaking his head. Sir Reginald was a pillar of the community, despite his forthright manner. Mrs. Croft nodded, but her eyes flicked to Nigel, who shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze moving from face to face. She had learned long ago that the truth often hid in the spaces between words, in the glances and hesitations that betrayed the heart. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, setting down his cup. "I've completed my examination," he said gravely. Sir Reginald died of arsenic poisoning, administered through his lemonade. It acted quickly, within minutes, I'd wager. The killer knew precisely what they were doing. A hush fell over the room. Lily's teapot clinked against a saucer, and Blackwood's jaw tightened. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the implications. Arsenic was not a common household item, yet it was accessible. In rat poison, sheep dip, or even medical supplies. The question was not only who had access, but who had the nerve to use it in broad daylight. The constable, Mr. Polk, had joined the gathering, his notebook open and his pencil poised. A young man with more enthusiasm than experience, he looked to Miss Marple for guidance. "I've questioned everyone," he said, "but alibis are tricky." He did mention something about the vicarage debt, but it was hardly a conversation for a fete. Miss Marple tilted her head, recalling Mrs. Price Ridley's gossip about the lien. Debt could fester, she knew, like a wound left untreated. Blackwood grunted, crossing his arms. "I was at my vegetable stall, same as always. Saw the squire drinking his lemonade, looking smug as ever. We'd argued about my fields. He wanted to sell 'em for some fancy estate plan, but I didn't touch his drink." His tone was gruff, but his eyes darted to the floor, and Miss Marple wondered if his anger ran deeper than he let on. Lily, prompted by a nudge from the vicar, spoke reluctantly. "I poured lemonade for everyone, including Sir Reginald. He was rude as usual, accused me of shortchanging him. But I didn't do nothing wrong." Her cheeks flushed, and her hands clenched the tray. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her, remembering the girl's dismissal for alleged theft. A public slight, she thought, could kindle a dangerous spark. Miss Vera Langston spoke last, her voice cool as a winter stream. "I was mingling, enjoying the fete. I had no reason to wish Cousin Reginald harm, though we weren't close." Her gloved hands rested calmly in her lap, but Miss Marple noted a faint smudge on one glove. Soil, perhaps, or something else. Vera's claim to the estate, however small, was a thread worth tugging. As the tea tray was cleared, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the lemonade itself. "The glass," she said. "Was it one of many, or marked in some way?" Dr. Haydock frowned, recalling the scene. "Just an ordinary glass, but the bottle nearby had a smudged label as if someone handled it roughly." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "People are so careless," she said, "with what they touch." She recalled the bottle she'd seen near the barn, its rim dusted with a fine powder. Not sugar, she thought, but something more sinister. The vicar, eager to lighten the mood, offered more scones, but the air remained heavy. Miss remained furrowed. Miss Marple walked home through the village, the late afternoon light softening the outlines of the thatched roofs. She passed the barn, now quiet, its doors locked. A stray petal from Mrs. Croft's roses lay in the grass, and she paused, her mind turning over the clues. The smudged bottle, Nigel's trimmer, Vera's glove, each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was incomplete. She thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a grocer's assistant had been wrongly accused of theft, his pride wounded until the truth emerged. "People," she murmured, "are never quite what they seem." Back at Mead, she settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. The fire crackled, and her tea grew cold as she pondered. Arsenic required planning, a steady hand, and a moment's opportunity. The fete had provided the chaos, but the killer had provided the intent. As the church clock chimed 5, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The truth, she knew, was in the details. And in St. Mary Mead, details were never in short supply. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Garden. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the lanes as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Briarwood Manor on Tuesday afternoon. 3 days had passed since Sir Reginald Harrington's death at the village fete, and the air in St. Mary Mead carried a quiet unease, like a melody played in a minor key. Miss Marple, dressed in a sensible tweed skirt and her lavender cardigan, carried a basket of freshly cut roses from her garden, a pretext for her visit, though her true purpose was to observe. The manor, a grand Georgian pile with ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys, stood at the edge of the village, its gardens a riot of color even in the fading light. Miss Marple knew that gardens, like people, held secrets in their corners, and she intended to uncover what Briarwoods might reveal about the poison that had silenced the squire. Hollyhocks stood tall against the stone walls. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the beds, noting the vibrant health of the plants. Almost too vibrant, she thought, as if fed by something more than soil and care. "These roses," she remarked, pausing by a cluster of crimson blooms, "are quite splendid. Do you use any special treatments, Mr. Harrington?" Nigel shrugged, his gaze darting to the house. "Gibbs handles all that. Sprays for pests, I suppose. I don't bother with the details." His dismissive tone intrigued her. In her experience, those who claimed ignorance often knew more than they let on. As they walked, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the fete. "You were away for a telephone call, I believe, when your uncle collapsed." Nigel's jaw tightened. "Yes, I was at the lodge, calling my solicitor in London. Family matters, you know. I was back within 10 minutes. His alibi was plausible, but its vagueness nagged at her. Telephone calls, she thought, were convenient excuses, easily unverifiable in the chaos of a fete. She made a mental note to check the lodge's telephone log, if such a thing existed. Their path led to the greenhouse, a glass structure glinting in the evening light. Inside, rows of seedlings and exotic plants thrived under the humid air, their leaves brushing against the panes. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching a small tin on a shelf. Its label faded but marked with the word pesticide. She bent closer, noting a faint white residue around the lid, not unlike the powder she'd seen on the lemonade bottle near the barn. "Curious," she murmured, her voice low. Nigel, distracted by a buzzing bee, didn't hear. "This greenhouse," she said, straightening up, "must require careful handling of chemicals. Arsenic, perhaps, for pests." Nigel's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Arsenic? I wouldn't know. Gibbs might, but he's off today." His defensiveness was telling, and Miss Marple filed it away, her mind turning over the possibility of poison stored so close to the manor. As they left the greenhouse, a commotion at the gate drew their attention. Mrs. Price Ridley, the postmistress. "Mrs. Croft mentioned a debt at the tea yesterday. Do you know more?" The postmistress, never one to resist, leaned in. "It's an old family matter. Her father owed Sir Reginald's father a sum, and the squire was pressing for repayment. She was quite cross about it, I heard." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. Debt could drive desperate acts, but poison required a colder resolve. She thanked Mrs. Price Ridley and continued her walk, her eyes scanning the garden for further clues. Near the barn, now cordoned off by the constable's orders, she spotted a stray button half buried in the grass. It was small, brass, and etched with a faint floral pattern, the sort found on a man's coat, or perhaps a glove. She knelt, careful not to touch it, and recalled the crowd at the fete. Blackwood in his worn jacket, Nigel's tailored blazer, Vera's elegant gloves. "Curious," she said softly, straightening up. The button was out of place, a tiny anomaly in the rustic setting. She made a note to ask Mr. Polk to collect it, though she suspected it might be a false lead, planted to mislead. As she returned to the manor's front path, she encountered Lily, the former maid, carrying a basket of laundry. The girl's face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "They're saying I poisoned him because he sacked me. It's not true. He accused me of stealing, but I never touched his silver." Miss Marple patted her arm, her voice soothing. There, my dear. The truth has a way of surfacing, like cream in a churn." Lily nodded, but her hand shook as she gripped the basket, and Miss Marple wondered if fear, not guilt, drove her distress. The evening deepened, and Miss Marple took her leave, her basket lighter, but her mind heavy with observations. The garden, with its vibrant blooms and hidden pesticides, was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead. Beautiful on the surface, but harboring secrets in its shadows. Nigel's shaky alibi. St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. Misdirection at the manor. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of deepening blues, with the first stars pricking through as Miss Jane Marple approached Briarwood Manor. It was Wednesday, 4 days since Sir Reginald Harrington's death at the village fete, and the village hummed with speculation, each rumor more tangled than the last. Miss Marple, her straw hat replaced by a neat shawl for the chilly evening, carried a small basket of homemade scones, a polite excuse for her presence at the manor's dinner, though her true aim was to observe the suspects under pressure. The manor's stone facade loomed ahead, its windows glowing with lamplight, promising a gathering where secrets might slip like crumbs from a table. Miss Marple knew that dinners, like tea parties, had a way of stirring truths to the surface, especially when nerves were frayed and tongues loosened by wine. Nigel Harrington, the late squire's nephew, had invited a small group to dine, ostensibly to discuss the estate's future but clearly to quell the village's whispers. Miss Marple was greeted at the door by Lily, the former maid, now temporarily rehired to serve. The girl's auburn curls were pinned tightly, but her eyes were wary, her hands gripping the tray with a tension that spoke of more than fatigue. "Evening, Miss Marple," she muttered, leading her into the dining room. The room was grand, with a polished oak table set with silver candelabras and crystal glasses, though the air was heavy with unease. Nigel sat at the head, his London suit creased, his fingers drumming on the tablecloth. Mrs. Eleanor Croft, the vicar's wife, sat opposite, her prim smile masking a flicker of anxiety. Mr. Josiah Blackwood, the farmer, slouched in his chair, his weathered hands ill at ease with the fine cutlery. Miss Vera Langston, Sir Reginald's distant cousin, sat with regal poise, her silk dress catching the candlelight, her gloved hands folded calmly. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, completed the group, his kindly demeanor a steadying presence amid the tension. Tempers. Mrs. Croft set down her spoon with a clink. "Some say it was no accident," she said, her tone sharp. "Poison doesn't slip into a glass by chance." Her eyes flicked to Lily, who froze, her tray trembling. "Don't look at me," Lily snapped, her voice rising. "I poured the lemonade, yes, but I didn't poison nobody. He sacked me for nothing, called me a thief." Her outburst drew gasps, and Nigel's face reddened. "Enough, Lily," he said. "No one's accusing you. Yet." Miss Marple tilted her head, noting the "yet." Accusations, she knew, were often a smokescreen for guilt. She turned to Vera, whose calm demeanor stood out amid the fray. "Miss Langston," she said gently, "you were near the barn during the fete, were you not? Did you notice anything unusual?" Vera's smile was cool, her voice measured. "I was admiring the roses, Miss Marple. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, though I recall Nigel slipping away for his call." Her words were polite, but the jab at Nigel was clear, and he bristled. "I told you, it was a solicitor," he said, his fingers tightening on his glass. "Family business, nothing more." Blackwood, silent until now, grunted. "Family business, eh? Like selling off my fields? Your uncle was set to ruin me, and now you'll likely finish the job." His voice was low, but the anger in it cut through the room. Nigel paled, and Mrs. Croft intervened, her voice soothing but strained. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We're all grieving." Miss Marple noted the way her hand brushed a small brooch, a nervous habit perhaps, or a clue to something deeper. Dr. Haydock, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat. "The inquest confirmed arsenic, but the source is unclear. It could have come from anywhere. A shed, a chemist, even a medical cabinet. His words hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes drifted to Vera's gloves, one faintly smudged with what looked like soil. Miss Langston, she said, was stirring the pot. And not just with consommé. As dessert, a modest apple tart was served. Lily's movements grew clumsier, her tray nearly tipping. "They're all pointing fingers," she muttered, loud enough for Miss Marple to hear. "But I saw Miss Langston near the lemonade stall, fussing with her gloves. Why's no one asking her?" Vera's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Mind your place, girl," she said coldly. "I was nowhere near the lemonade." The exchange was brief but electric, and Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibility of a deliberate misdirection. Lily's accusation felt too pointed, too convenient. A servant's resentment, or a calculated ploy. The dinner ended with strained farewells, the guests dispersing into the night. Nigel lingered, offering Miss Marple a ride home, which she declined with a smile. "A walk clears the mind, Mr. Harrington," she said, noting his unsteady gait. As she stepped into the cool air, she paused by the manor's rosebeds, her eyes catching a faint glint in the moonlight. A glass vial, half buried in the soil near the lavender. She didn't touch it, but its presence sent a shiver through her. Arsenic, she knew, was often stored in such vials, and its location in the garden suggested more than carelessness. Was it Vera's, tied to her smudged glove, or another's, planted to mislead? Walking home through St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the evening. The dinner had been a stage, each suspect playing a part. Nigel's defensiveness, Mrs. Croft's indignation, Blackwood's anger, Lily's defiance, Vera's icy calm. The rat poison rumor, so loudly proclaimed, felt like a red herring, designed to cloud the truth. She thought of a long-ago incident in the village, when a false rumor about a stolen necklace had nearly ruined a young woman, only unraveled by a careful tracing of motives. People, she murmured, had decided to visit the village shop, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea at the vicarage. Her knitting needles, tucked into her basket alongside a skein of pale blue wool, were a prop. But her true tools were her sharp eyes and sharper mind. In St. Mary Mead, she knew, the truth often hid in the chatter of neighbors, tangled among half-truths and hasty conclusions. The shop, a cramped space with shelves groaning under tins of biscuits and jars of sweets, was run by Mrs. Weatherby, a plump woman with a knack for hearing everything and repeating most of it. As Miss Marple entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Mrs. Weatherby looked up from her ledger, her eyes gleaming with the promise of news. "Miss Marple, you've heard, I'm sure, about the letter," she said, barely pausing for breath. "Found in the vicarage postbox, addressed to no one, claiming Mrs. Croft was, well, carrying on with Sir Reginald." Her voice dropped to a scandalized whisper, and Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her expression mild. "A letter, you say? How extraordinary. May I see it?" Mrs. Weatherby produced the document, a single sheet of cheap paper, its ink smudged but legible. The words were vicious, accusing Mrs. Eleanor Croft of an affair with the squire, suggesting her motive for his murder was to silence a scandal. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, noting the uneven handwriting and the faint scent of lavender on the paper, not unlike the blooms in Briarwood Manor's garden. "Most curious," she murmured. "And who found this?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. "Young Tommy, the stable boy, when he delivered the vicar's post. He's been telling everyone." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the possibility of a forgery. Letters, she knew, could be as deceptive as the people who wrote them, and this one felt too convenient, too designed to inflame. Determined to verify the rumor, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Croft was tending her roses in the front garden. The vicar's wife, her auburn hair pinned neatly by with a basket of laundry. Her auburn curls were damp with mist, and her expression was sullen. "They're all talking about that letter," she muttered, unprompted. "But I saw Miss Langston near the vicarage yesterday, dropping something in the postbox. Didn't look like a bill." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Vera Langston, the squire's distant cousin, had been a quiet presence at the manor dinner, her gloved hands and cool demeanor masking her intentions. "Thank you, Lily," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but probing. "You've a sharp eye." Lily shrugged, but her cheeks flushed, and Miss Marple wondered if the girl's observation was truth or spite. Her next stop was Blackwood's farm, a sprawling patch of land on the village's edge where the farmer was repairing a fence. Mr. Josiah Blackwood, his face weathered like the oak he hammered, greeted her with a grunt. "Miss Marple, come to poke about the murder, I reckon," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. She smiled, offering a scone. "I'm merely curious, Mr. Blackwood. There's talk of a letter, and of course your disagreement with Sir Reginald over the land." Blackwood's hammer paused, his eyes darkening. "He wanted to sell my fields for some fancy estate. I told him where he could shove his plans. But poison, that's not my way." He gestured to a shed nearby, its door ajar. "Constable Polk already searched it. Found arsenic bottles for sheep dip. Nothing to do with the fete." Miss Marple peered into the shed, noting the dusty bottles labeled arsenic for agricultural use. The labels were faded, but none bore the smudged marks of the lemonade bottle at the barn. Another false trail, she thought, designed to distract. "You were at your stall during the fete, I believe," she asked. Blackwood nodded. "Never left it, except to fetch more marrows. Tommy can vouch for me." His alibi was solid, but his clenched jaw suggested a deeper resentment. Perhaps not for murder, but for something unspoken. Had motive, an affair, and Sir Reginald threatening to expose her. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Gossip is a powerful thing, Mrs. Price Ridley," she said. "But letters can be forged, and motives invented." The postmistress faltered, then rallied. "Well, someone wrote it, and I'd wager it's no coincidence." Miss Marple noted the lavender scent lingering in her memory. Could it tie to Vera's gloves, or was it another distraction? At Dane Mead, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking as the fire cast flickering shadows. The letter, the arsenic bottles, Lily's accusation, Tommy's observation, each was a thread in the tapestry, but some were meant to unravel. The letter felt like a deliberate misdirection, its accusations too bold to be true. She thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a forged note had nearly ruined a young couple, only undone by tracing the ink to a local shop. "People," she murmured. think they can hide behind lies, but lies leave traces. The lavender scent, Nigel's nervousness, Blackwood's alibi, Mrs. Croft's fear. They formed a puzzle, but the pieces were scattered. As the church clock chimed noon, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The village's gossip had spun a web, but the truth lay in untangling it. Chapter 7. A Crucial Observation. The late afternoon light bathed St. Mary Mead in a soft golden glow, filtering through the elms that lined the village green as Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden at Danemead. It was Friday, 6 days since Sir Reginald Harrington's poisoning at the Briarwood Barn fete, and the village was restless, its usual calm frayed by whispers of murder. Miss Marple, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, worked on her knitting, a pale blue scarf for her nephew Raymond, but her mind was far from the stitches. Her small table held a cup of cooling tea and a notebook where she jotted observations, for she knew that the truth, like a dropped stitch, could be found in the smallest details. The events of the past week, the smudged lemonade bottle, the forged letter, the garden vine. Her reverie was broken by the arrival of young Tommy, the stable boy, who bounded into the garden with a flushed face. "Miss Marple," he said, catching his breath, "I remembered something from the fete, something I didn't tell the constable." She set down her needles, her eyes bright with interest. "Do tell, Tommy," she said gently. "Every detail matters." He shuffled his feet, then said, "I saw Miss Langston near the barn, right before Sir Reginald collapsed. She was holding a lemonade glass, but she set it down quick-like when she saw me. And her gloves had a funny smell, like medicine." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "A medicinal smell. Perhaps arsenic, or something meant to mimic it." "You're a sharp lad, Tommy," she said. "And where was this glass?" He pointed vaguely toward the barn. "Behind the hay bales, where Sir Reginald was found." The observation sent a spark through Miss Marple's mind. She recalled the smudged lemonade bottle, its label matching those from Dr. Haydock's surgery, where he kept medical supplies. Could Vera have accessed arsenic there? But Dr. Haydock, with his kindly demeanor and spotless reputation, had no motive. She thanked Tommy, sending him off with a scone, and turned her thoughts to the surgery. A visit was in order, she decided, to confirm the bottle's origin. The village surgery, a tidy building next to the church, smelled of antiseptic and beeswax. Dr. Haydock greeted her warmly, his eyes twinkling despite the strain of recent events. "Miss Marple, come to check my pulse or solve a murder?" he teased, ushering her into his office. She smiled, producing a jar of her homemade jam as a pretext. "I was wondering," she said, "about those lemonade bottles from the fete. They seemed familiar. Perhaps from your stock?" Dr. Haydock frowned, leading her to a storeroom where glass bottles lined the shelves, their labels crisp and blue. "These are mine," he said, auburn curls escaping her scarf. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice trembling, "I've got to tell you. I saw Mr. Harrington, Nigel, I mean, with a vial like that one in the greenhouse the day before the fete. He was tucking it in his pocket." Her words were rushed, her eyes wide with fear or guilt. Miss Marple patted her arm, her voice soothing. "Thank you, Lily, but we must be sure of what we see. Vials can hold many things, medicine, perhaps, or even perfume." Lily nodded, but her hands shook, and Miss Marple wondered if the girl was deflecting suspicion or revealing a truth. Determined to follow this thread, Miss Marple visited the manor's greenhouse, where she had seen the pesticide tin. The glass structure was humid, its air thick with the scent of earth and blooms. She found no vials, but her eyes caught a faint trace of lavender on the workbench. Not the plant, but a sharper chemical scent, like Tommy's description of Vera's gloves. The connection was tenuous, but it stirred a memory of Vera at the fete, handling lemonade glasses despite her known allergy to citrus. Miss Marple paused, her mind turning over the contradiction. "How very odd," she said softly. "An allergy, yet no reaction." To test her theory, she stopped by the vicarage where Mrs. Croft was arranging flowers. "Mrs. Croft," she said, "do you recall Miss Langston's habits at the fete? She helped with the lemonade, I believe." Mrs. Croft frowned, her shears pausing. "Yes, now you mention it, she did pour a few glasses. Strange, considering her allergy. She's always complaining about citrus." The confirmation was subtle but significant. Vera's ease with the lemonade suggested either a lie about her allergy or a careful avoidance of contact, unless she wore gloves to protect herself while slipping something into a glass. Back at Mead, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as the fire cast shadows. The lavender scent, Nigel's vial, Vera's gloves, the smudge them together. Chapter 8. Narrowing the Net. The early evening air in St. Mary Mead carried the faint chill of approaching autumn, a whisper of change that mirrored the shifting tides of Miss Jane Marple's investigation. It was Saturday, a week since Sir Reginald Harrington's poisoning at the Briarwood Barn fete, and the village, though outwardly calm, simmered with unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple sat in her cozy parlor at Mead, the fire casting a warm glow over her knitting, a nearly completed scarf for her nephew Raymond. Her small oak table held a pot of Earl Grey and a notebook filled with neat jottings, each a fragment of the puzzle she was piecing together. The smudged lemonade bottle, the forged letter, the lavender-scented gloves, and the curious vial in the greenhouse had all pointed to a deliberate act. But the killer's identity remained elusive. Tonight, Miss Marple resolved to tighten the net, her sharp mind sifting through the clues to separate truth from deception. Her first task was to confirm alibis, and she began with Mr. Josiah Blackwood, the gruff farmer whose land disputes with Sir Reginald had made him a suspect. She found him at his farm, mending a gate under the fading light. His weathered face, etched with lines like the furrows of his fields, softened slightly at her approach. "Miss Marple," he grunted, setting down his hammer. "Come to accuse me of murder, have you?" She smiled, offering a small jar of her homemade jam. "Not at all, Mr. Blackwood. I merely wish to clarify your movements at the fete." He wiped his hands on his trousers, his eyes wary but honest. "I was at my stall, selling marrows. Never left except to fetch more from the cart. Young Tommy saw me. He'll vouch for it." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Tommy's earlier confirmation. "And the arsenic bottles in your shed?" she asked gently. Blackwood's jaw tightened. Her alibi was corroborated by multiple witnesses, and the forged letter, with its lavender scent, pointed to a deliberate attempt to frame her. Miss Marple patted her hand. "A cruel distraction, my dear. Someone wished to cloud the truth." Mrs. Croft's relief was palpable, and Miss Marple mentally cleared her. The letter's falsehood a misdirection now unraveled. With 2 suspects eliminated, Miss Marple turned her attention to Nigel Harrington, whose nervous habits had drawn her scrutiny. She found him at Briarwood Manor, pacing the library, a cigarette smoldering in his hand. His London suit was rumpled, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." She settled into a leather chair, her knitting in her lap. "Merely thorough, Mr. Harrington. Your telephone call at the fete. Can anyone confirm it?" Nigel's fingers twitched, the cigarette trembling. "I was at the lodge, speaking to my solicitor. No one saw me, but I was only gone 10 minutes. His lack of witnesses was troubling, and Miss Marple pressed further. "Lily mentioned a vial in your pocket, the day before the fete. Care to explain?" Nigel's face paled, his voice rising. "She's lying. It was a headache powder, nothing more. I'm no murderer." His tremor, she insisted to herself, was nerves, not guilt. A young man caught in a storm of suspicion, but not necessarily the one wielding the lightning. As she left the manor, Miss Marple paused by the rose beds, where a faint glint caught her eye. A small brass button, etched with a floral pattern, half buried in the soil. It matched the one she'd seen near the barn, suggesting a connection. She recalled Vera Langston's gloves, one smudged with what might be soil or poison, and her ease with the lemonade despite her claimed citrus allergy. The button, she thought, could belong to a glove, not a coat, a detail overlooked in the fete's chaos. She made a note to ask Constable Polk to collect it, her mind turning over its significance. Her final stop was the village hall, where Lynn had dismissed it as litter, but Tommy described it as a scrap of paper with Vera's initials and a cryptic phrase, "Inheritance denied." Miss Marple requested to see it, and Polk delivered it to Mead that evening. A torn note, written in elegant script, hinting at Vera's grudge over a spurned family claim. The lavender scent clung to it, matching the gloves and the forged letter. "How very telling," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes gleaming. At Mead, she settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking as the fire cast shadows. The net was tightening. Blackwood and Mrs. Croft were cleared, their alibis solid and motives diluted by evidence. Nigel's tremor was nerves, his vial likely innocent, though his shaky alibi kept him in the frame. Lily's resentment was real, but her observation of Vera's packet was too specific to dismiss. Vera, with her gloves, her citrus anomaly, and the incriminating note, was emerging as the linchpin. Miss Marple thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a hidden letter had revealed a thief's motive, uncovered by a single, overlooked detail. "People," she murmured, "think they can bury their secrets, but they always leave a trace." As the church clock chimed 7, Miss Marple's mind was alight. The lavender-scented note, the glove's smudge, the packet in Vera's hand. These were the threads to pull. The killer had woven a careful web, but one tug could unravel it. In St. Mary Mead, the truth was never far from the surface, and Miss Marple was ready to bring it to light. Chapter 9. The Revelation in the Barn. The late afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead. painting the stone walls of Briarwood Barn with a soft amber glow. It was Sunday, 8 days since Sir Reginald Harrington's poisoning at the village fete, and the air held a quiet tension, as if the village itself awaited the unraveling of its darkest secret. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl neatly draped over her shoulders, stood just inside the barn's heavy oak doors, her sharp eyes scanning the space where the trails of mud. Lily, the dismissed maid, hovered near the door, her auburn curls escaping her scarf, her expression a mix of defiance and fear. Miss Vera Langston, Sir Reginald's distant cousin, glided in last, her silk dress impeccable, her gloved hands clasped with an air of cool detachment. Constable Polk stood by Miss Marple, his notebook open, his youthful face taut with anticipation. Dr. Haydock, the physician, was there too, his kindly presence a steady anchor in the charged atmosphere. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but commanding. "Thank you for coming," she said, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. Sir Reginald's death was no accident, but a carefully planned act of murder. The truth lies in the details, and today those details will speak. A murmur rippled through the group, and Nigel's cigarette case slipped from his fingers, clattering on the floor. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind as sharp as her knitting needles. "Let us begin with the lemonade," she said, gesturing to the spot where Sir Reginald had fallen, behind a stack of hay bales. A glass poisoned with arsenic was his undoing. But how did it reach him, and who placed it there? She turned to Nigel, whose face paled. "Mr. Harrington, you were absent during the fete, making a telephone call, you said. Yet no one can confirm it, and your nervousness, your trembling hands, suggested guilt." Nigel's voice rose, indignant. "I told you, it was a solicitor. I didn't touch his drink." Miss Marple nodded, her tone soothing. "Indeed, and young Tommy saw you at the lodge, too far from the barn to act in time. Your nerves, I believe, stem from fear of losing your inheritance, not from murder." Nigel exhaled, relief mingling with unease, and Miss Marple crossed him off her mental list. Next, she addressed Mrs. Croft, whose fingers twisted her brooch. "Mrs. Croft, a forged letter accused you of an affair, a cruel attempt to paint you as the killer. But your alibi at the flower stall is solid. Confirmed." "Cracked. I didn't do it. I saw Miss Langston near the stall, with a packet in her hand." Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm. "I believe you, my dear. Your resentment is real, but your hands were too busy serving to tamper with a single glass unnoticed." Lily's relief was palpable, though her eyes darted to Vera. All eyes turned to Miss Langston, whose composure faltered, her gloved hands tightening. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice steady. "Miss Langston, you present a puzzle. You claimed a citrus allergy, yet you handled lemonade glasses with ease. Your gloves, scented with lavender, bore a smudge, not soil, but arsenic powder, I suspect. And a note found in this barn bore your initials and spoke of a denied inheritance." Vera's face drained of color, her voice sharp. "This is absurd. I admired the roses, nothing more. You've no proof." Miss Marple gestured to the hay bales, where Constable Polk had retrieved a small brass button etched with a floral pattern. "This button," she said, "came from a glove, not a coat, dropped in your haste to switch the poisoned glass. The lemonade bottle, smudged to hide its origin, came from Dr. Haydock's surgery, where you visited days before the fete, claiming a headache. And the note, inheritance denied, reveals your motive. Sir Reginald discovered your attempt to forge family documents, inflating your claim to the estate. He threatened to expose you, didn't he? The barn was silent, the air thick with tension. Vera's eyes darted to the door, but Constable Paulk stepped forward, his hand on his notebook. Miss Langston, Miss Marple continued, you slipped arsenic from a chemist's packet into the glass, using your gloves to avoid contact. The lavender scent, meant to mask the poison, clung to your hands. You thought you'd covered your tracks, but the smallest details betray us. Vera's composure shattered, her voice breaking. He was going to ruin me. Those documents were my right, my family's legacy. I had no choice. Would need time to heal. She thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a hidden grudge had led to a theft, uncovered by a single misplaced clue. People, she murmured, think they can hide their hearts, but the truth always finds a way. The barn's shadows deepened, but the light of resolution had broken through, and St. Mary Mead could breathe again. Tea and explanations. The morning sun streamed through the lace-curtained windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, Mead, casting delicate patterns across the parlor's polished oak floor. It was Monday, 9 days since Sir Reginald Harrington's tragic poisoning at the Briarwood Barn fete, and St. Mary Mead was slowly settling back into its gentle rhythm, though the echoes of murder lingered like a faint mist over the meadows. Miss Marple, her snowy hair tucked neatly under a soft gray shawl, presided over a small gathering for morning tea, her table adorned with a white linen cloth, a pot of steaming Darjeeling, and a plate of freshly baked scones. Her knitting, a pale blue scarf for her nephew Raymond, lay folded beside her, its needles silent for now, as her sharp mind turned to the task of explaining the tangled web of clues that had led to the unmasking of a killer. In St. Mary Mead, tea was more than a ritual. It was a moment for truths to be shared, and Miss Marple knew that her guests, gathered in her cozy parlor, sought closure as much as clarity. The vicar, Reverend Leonard Clement, sat across from her, his poet's eyes softened by relief. Beside him was Dr. Haydock, the village physician, his kindly face creased with curiosity. Mrs. Eleanor Croft, the vicar's wife, sipped her tea with a steadier hand than she had in days, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. Mr. Josiah Blackwood, the farmer, perched awkwardly on a chintz-covered chair, his weathered hands resting uneasily on his knees. Nigel Harrington, Sir Reginald's nephew, leaned against the mantel, his London suit less polished but his expression lighter, as if a burden had lifted. Lily, his hand during the fete's chaos. But it was not a random act. It was personal, calculated, and rooted in a grudge that festered for years. She turned to Nigel, whose fingers twitched reflexively. Mr. Harrington, your absence during the fete raised suspicion, and your nervous habits, your trembling hands, your cigarette case, suggested guilt. But Tommy's testimony placed you at the lodge, and your fear was of losing your inheritance, not of murder. Nigel exhaled, his voice low. I'm glad it's over, Miss Marple. Uncle was hard, but I didn't want him dead. She nodded, her eyes kind. Greed can cloud judgment, but it did not drive you to kill. Next, she addressed Mrs. Croft, whose brooch gleamed in the sunlight. Mrs. Croft, the forged letter accusing you of an affair was a cruel misdirection. scented with lavender to point elsewhere. Your alibi at the flower stall was unshakable, and your distress was genuine. Mrs. Croft's eyes welled with tears. It was a wicked lie, Miss Marple. Thank you for seeing through it. Miss Marple patted her hand. Lies are loud, my dear, but the truth speaks softly. Blackwood shifted, his scowl softening. And you, Mr. Blackwood, Miss Marple said, had reason to resent Sir Reginald's land plans. The arsenic bottles in your shed seemed damning, but they were for sheep dip, and your stall kept you busy, as Tommy confirmed. Blackwood grunted, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Knew I wasn't the sort for poison. Too messy. The room chuckled, the tension easing, and Miss Marple moved on. Lily, she said, turning to the maid, your dismissal for alleged theft gave you motive, and your presence at the lemonade stall made you a suspect. But your hands were too busy serving, and your accusation against Miss Langston was born of observation, not guilt. Lily's shoulders relaxed, her voice soft. I just wanted the truth out, Miss Marple. He wronged me, but I didn't hurt him. Miss Marple's smile was warm. Truth has a way of rising, like cream in a churn. All eyes amount of arsenic, stored in a chemist's packet she concealed in her glove. The lavender scent, meant to mask the poison, clung to her hands, and the note confirmed her fear. Sir Reginald had discovered her attempt to forge family documents, inflating her claim to the estate. He threatened to expose her, and she acted to silence him. Constable Polk nodded, his voice awed. You pieced it together like a puzzle, Miss Marple. That note, the button, it all fits. She smiled faintly. Puzzles are merely patterns, Mr. Polk. The trick is seeing the whole picture. Mrs. Croft spoke up, her voice hesitant. But why the forged letter about me? Miss Marple's eyes softened. A distraction, my dear, to muddy the waters. Vera knew gossip would spread, pointing suspicion elsewhere. The room fell silent, the weight of the explanation settling over them. Nigel broke the quiet, his voice subdued. She seemed so composed. I never suspected. Miss Marple nodded. Human nature, Mr. Harrington, hides behind masks. Greed, resentment, fear. They drive us to act, but they leave traces. She thought of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead when a villager's hidden envy had led to a petty crime uncovered by a single misplaced word. The truth, she said, is in the details. The smudge on a glove, the scent of lavender, the haste of a dropped button. The vicar raised his cup, his voice warm. You've done us a great service, Miss Marple. The village can heal now. She smiled, pouring another round of tea. Another cup, dear? She asked, her tone light but her eyes still sharp. The guests nodded, their faces relaxed, the harmony of St. Mary Mead restored. Lily stepped forward, offering a shy smile. I'll bake you some scones, Miss Marple, to say thanks. Blackwood grunted his agreement, and even Nigel managed a genuine smile. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the village come alive with morning routines, the milkman's cart, the children playing on the green. The mystery was solved, the killer unmasked, and St. Mary Mead could return to its quiet way.